Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Adam W. Rodriguez, and this is The Art of R. Today, I'm going to be doing a book review about Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It is a great American classic novel, and I'm really excited to talk about it. It is a book that's about 600 plus pages. I actually read it in two parts. I did like the first 300 or so pages in September, and then I put it down so that I could read some spooky books during Halloween. And then I picked it back up in December. That's when the boat, the Pequod, disembarks in the actual story. So I figured, hey, I'll read it in December because things start happening in December with that particular book. So, and I'm glad I did, because I got to really kind of absorb what I had read a little bit and then picked it back up. I think if I did it over again, I would do it in quarters, because let me just start by talking about Herman Melville right now. Herman Melville is an interesting character. He had kind of developed a reputation as an adventurer slash author. His first couple of books were really successful. And Moby Dick itself was not a commercial success. As far as when he published it, there wasn't near as much praise for this one as his first couple of books. He ended up having to work several jobs elsewhere. He published a lot of poetry and stuff near the end of his life, with some marginal success, but not the success that he had had early in his career. The book, Moby Dick, didn't become like a great American classic until the centennial of his birth. Like 100 years after Melville was born, people started to reconnect with his works, and that's when Moby Dick became the great American classic that it is. That's where its renown came from, was when they just sort of addressed and analyzed this particular work. This book has been analyzed so much. There's so much literature out there about the allegories therein and stuff like that. Including whole papers that are about, like, maybe it's just a book about a guy chasing a whale. You know what I mean? There's this great chunk in the top part of the book where he's in this bar, or in this inn. And at the end, there's this painting that is like weather beaten and faded and cracked to the point where you can't quite see what's going on in it, but you know it's a painting of like whaling and all that kind of stuff. And it turns into this kind of nebulous thing that sort of has an eldritch horror feel to it, like some sort of impending atmospheric doom lurks in this painting. There's a lot of like kind of Lovecraftian things about Moby Dick that I think are really, really interesting. There's a part where one of the ship boys, who is normally, on deck during all the whaling hunting parts, but he ends up on one of the smaller whale boats that goes out and chases the whale, and he jumps out of the boat, and they end up having to cut free the whale that they were pursuing to save this kid. Well, the second time he ends up jumping out of the boat, they just leave his ass, and he stays in the water long enough to where they return to pick him up and go back to the boat, he's completely gone mad. He's seen things there in the open water that has driven this boy to like insanity. So there's a lot of this kind of cool Lovecraftian, the horrors beneath the waves kind of stuff. I looked in vain for anything about Lovecraft commenting on Melville, and I couldn't find anything. I mean, maybe it was just kind of a common theme of just people fearing the monsters that lie beneath the crushing depths of the ocean. Anyway, I found the book itself having these really, really cool, just kind of haunting style chapters. I myself would consider Moby Dick a Gothic horror book. It does check off all of the boxes for Gothic horror. You know, you've got this kind of supernatural atmosphere. You know, you've got the kind of dark, brooding style text and prose. And even I would say like the kind of haunted house or castle is definitely characterized by the Pequod, the boat that they are on, because it becomes sort of a character in itself in this particular story, and I think it's really, really awesome. Melville's writing style kind of moves all over the place in it as well, and there's like chapters near the back that are like suddenly done in like play format, you know, with like stage directions and stuff like that. It's kind of odd, and it just kind of like, you know, it just seems like a guy who's like, I'm just gonna go for it. Yes, there is a bit of a slog in this book. Like there are whole chapters that are dedicated to like cataloging whales and how the cord is made that is used on the harpoons, and how harpoons are forged, how they extract whale oil from the whale and the whale's heads. Some of that gets to be really wordy and long, and I remember just kind of like yawning through some of those chapters, but I will say that he has a great poetic style. You could tell the man was a very dedicated poet. His verbiage was rich and thick, and I mean, this was written or published in 1851. So the old world language is definitely in there. There's a lot of references to the Bible, you know, it's particularly Job, or not Job, Jonah and the whale. And there's a lot of Shakespearean referencing going on in the book itself. So a lot of Melville pulling from, literature elsewhere. I will say this, like there are two chapters that I found particularly great. Now, this is a long ass book, and if you don't want to read 600 pages of Moby Dick, there's this one chapter, I believe it's called the Town Ho, which was the name of this ship. Yeah, the Town Ho story. It's chapter 54. If you don't want to read all of Moby Dick, just read chapter 54. It's this really, really cool story within the context of the story, where Ishmael is sitting in this bar called the Golden Inn, and he's sitting there with these two Spaniards, and he tells these Spaniards a Moby Dick story, where he talks about one of the ships that they had encountered in their travels, and this kind of like tale within the tale. It's a really, really cool, solid story. Most of the chapters in this book are really short. They're like 2-page chapters and 6-page chapters and some 10-page chapters. But chapter 54 is like 22, 25 pages. So it's a nice little short story length chapter where you get a full kind of Herman Melville tells a Moby Dick story experience. So maybe if you just want to dip your toe into some of Melville's, Moby Dick stories, that's a great chapter. Just read chapter 54, see what you think. It's a solid chapter. It's one of my favorites. I keep going back to it. I've read it like a couple of times since I've read this book. I'm just like, I really like that chapter, and I'll go back and I'll read it. And speaking of chapters that I really, really like, and I go back and I read them, I believe it's chapter 70. Let me see here. I have these marked. Chapter 70, The Sphinx. It's this really, really great speech that Captain Ahab does. They've finally killed one of their first sperm whales. And what they do to render the whale is, they render the body first, and then they behead it. And then they send what's left of the carcass out to sea, and it gets bombarded by seabirds and sharks and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of really cool maritime and visceral imagery all throughout the book itself. Lots of blood, lots of teeth, But they behead the whale and they hoist it onto the side of the boat. And even then, the whale's head is too big to bring onto the boat. They have to like lash it to the side. And when it does that, the boat tilts with the head, right? And there's an old like mariner's tale or a mariner's superstition that if you get kill another whale and hoist its head on the other side of the boat, leveling it out, the tale is that the boat can never be capsized. It can never be, sunk, right? Which I thought was pretty cool. But there's this really, really haunting monologue that Ahab does when the sperm whale's head is lashed to the side. He comes out on deck and he leans over and just kind of whispers this weird, haunting kind of. It's like he's asking for something, but taunting it at the same time. It's really dark and interesting, and it's this nice little short monologue. I'm going to go ahead and read that monologue to you right now. Speak thou, vast and venerable head, which, though ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there lookest hoary with mosses. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers, thou hast dived the deepest. That head, upon which the upper sun now gleams, has moved amid the world's foundations, where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, where, in her murderous hold, this frigate Earth is ballasted with bones of millions of the drowned. There, in that awful waterland, there was thy most familiar home. Thou hast been where bell or diver never went, hast slept by many a sailor's side, where sleepless mothers would give their lives to lay them down. Thou sawest the locked lovers when leaping from their flaming ship, heart to heart they sank beneath the exulting wave, true to each other when heaven seemed false to them. Thou sawest the murdered mate when tossed by pirates from the midnight deck. For hours he fell into the deeper midnight of the insatiate maw, and his murderers still sailed on unharmed, while swift lightning shivered the neighboring ship that would have but borne a righteous husband to outstretched, longing arms. O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. I think it's a really, really cool speech. And I keep going back to it. I think it's quite lovely. I might turn it into a monologue one day. And the other thing that I have reread in this particular book is the ending. The last scene where they finally meet up with Moby Dick and the big, big encounter happens. And it is epic in scale. I love it. It is so dark and tragic and wonderful.
For hate's sake, I spit my last breath at thee, thou damned whale!
I love tragic endings. I don't know why, but I find them compelling and cool and dark, and I like that kind of stuff. So I can see why it didn't do well back in the day, and I can see why it became a classic afterwards. I read this unabridged version. So in the original version, which was published as The Whale, like he added the term Moby Dick later, or the title Moby Dick later. But in the original version, it was criticized because it seemed that all the sailors on the Pequod were dead by the end of the book, and this thing was narrated by Ishmael. So he ended up adding the epilogue later that illustrates how Ishmael was the lone survivor of the encounter with Moby Dick, which I thought was interesting as well. Now, the very first 150 to 200 pages of this book are absolutely delightful because it shows this really cool relationship developing between Queequeg, who is one of the harpooners. He's from this fictitious island in the South Seas, but it shows this really great relationship between Queequeg and Ishmael. That's kind of like Ishmael being from these kind of Puritan, Nantucket, American culture, meeting up with this savage or cannibal. I mean, some of the overt racism is in this book, and you move through it, but you recognize it for what it is. But you see this really, really cool like bromance budding between these two characters. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, if they maintain this kind of like cool relationship throughout the whole book, I think I'm gonna really, really like it. And unfortunately, right around page 200, Ishmael's focus is less on his relationship with Queequeg and more on him just observing Ahab and the other officers on the Pequod. So, I was kind of sad that there wasn't more of that, but I was really happy for the first 150 or so pages with all of that. Queequeg and Ishmael getting to bond. I thought that was really great. The effect of Moby Dick on arts in general is pretty widespread. I remember watching this old cartoon on Hanna Barbara where it was like these two kids in scuba gear that would hang out with Moby Dick, and Moby Dick would like save them from sea monsters and stuff like that. I also remember George Lucas made a whole alien race based off of Queequeg, and I think they're called like the Weequegs or something like that. And they're a big part of George Lucas's alien races in the Star Wars franchise, which you first saw in Jabba's palace. There was this guy that was like, oh God, I didn't even think about that. It's the part where Luke is being like walking the plank in the Dune Sea and being thrown into the Sarlacc pit. I didn't even think about the kind of nautical overtones that were going on there. Walk the plank, dive to your doom. Queequeg, the Weequeg, is shoving you in. Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I've even painted several Moby Dick paintings. I was doing it when I was trying to do like a kind of Gothic monsters series. And I remember thinking like Moby Dick is a Gothic monster. And I really like the idea of a giant white whale, the awesome force of nature, and one giant white whale. How cool is that? Nice. Oh, and I also forgot to mention like one of my favorite things that Moby Dick inspired, and that was the second Star Trek. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where Khan is just like this guy who is analogous of Captain Ahab, and his white whale is Captain Kirk. And it's full of like references by Melville's Moby Dick, and Ricardo Montalban is just chef's kiss, man. Chef's kiss.
There she is. There she is.
If you haven't watched that particular movie, oh my God, it's so good. It's so good.
From hell's heart, I stab at thee. For hate's sake, I spit my last breath at thee.
Ricardo. Oh, Ricardo, you're so badass. Oh my gosh, I love this guy. And I remember like I saw this movie like on the heels of watching a lot of Fantasy Island, because I was like raised in the 70s, and I watched that show, and then I watched him playing Khan, and I was like, my tiny mind was blown. Ricardo Montalban, you are a badass. Yes! Such a good movie. All in all, I will give Moby Dick a solid 8 out of 10. And it's only lost those 2 points because there are parts that drag really, really hard that, I guess it's purely from a, like, I'm not interested in some of this stuff because it doesn't really further the story. But what it does do is inform you on whaling. So it turns into, it's like part adventure story, part instruction manual in a lot of ways. And, sometimes people like that, but I wasn't having it that much. Like I said, I think if I had read this in quarters, it would be a lot more interesting. I remember when I read the very end of this book, I wasn't near as impressed. And then when I went back and reread it, like the second and third time, I am like on the edge of my seat. It's so great. So like, I think part of the problem with me in this book is that the parts that do drag kind of affect the parts that don't. And that's just my reading experience. Some folks can separate all of that a little bit better than I do. But I'm a guy that tries to absorb like every darn word. It's one of the reasons why I read really, really slow. I'm really, really glad I read Moby Dick. As far as classic literature is concerned, I can see why people love it so much, and I can see why people examine it and try to find deeper meaning all throughout it, because there are a lot of parts of this book that just allow the back of your head to kind of go in all sorts of cool directions. And I think that's the mark of really, really cool writing. Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I would suggest it to those who love classical literature and those who are just curious. Hey, read chapter 54, The Town Ho Story. You'll get yourself a quick Moby Dick story by Herman Melville, told by Ishmael. It's basically like a short form Moby Dick, right? So yeah, awesome. I hope you enjoyed watching this here video. I know I enjoyed making it. Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Really, really great book. I'm glad I read it. We will see you next time here at the Art of R. Ciao.